Okay, great. Thank you for joining us today, Annmarie. I truly appreciate it.
Oh, of course. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely, absolutely. All right. So before we jump in, for parents that might not know the difference, what is the difference between an occupational therapist and a physical therapist? And when would their children need to come to you?
Yeah, so physical therapists are wonderful. They focus mainly on like mobility, restoring function, maybe
Mhm.
like reducing pain, and preventing like further injury. So occupational therapy is a little bit different because we help people be able to do the things that they want and need to do as
Mhm.
independently as possible through like meaningful occupations. I always say, like, if you think of an occupation as an activity, it becomes a
Okay.
little bit more clear. I think we hear the word occupation, we think of a job,
We take a job. Yeah.
right. So occupations can be, feeding, sleeping, toileting, showering, play, leisure. There's a
Okay.
whole host of occupations that we partake in on a daily, weekly, basis. So
Okay.
with occupational therapy, we really want to focus on, like, for instance, I'm a pediatric therapist. So, a lot of what I do looks like play. And a lot of what I'll do is, taking certain toys or activities and that the child already prefers. And we find a
Mhm.
way to make it a little bit more therapeutic to work on, some of the goals that the child might have.
Okay. So, kind of building on that. So you're looking at tracking to skill sets and benchmarks based on their ages as you're going through this. So, what is a session going to look like with you?
Yeah, so it really depends. I work with infants, and I'm even, up through, kindergarten, grade school. I have some older, I'd say teenagers maybe that I'm working with, and now I'm even getting some
Mhm.
adults that have some disabilities too, just because these day
Okay.
programs, and I live in Connecticut, the day programs just are not, there's no availability for for spots
Right.
for these people. So it really just depends on the age. So, with infants, a lot of what I do is, just making sure that families understand tummy time, floor time is really important.
Mhm.
Working on like visual tracking. Everyone says to me, what do you do with like a 1 month old and a 2 month old? And it's like, oh my gosh, you can do so much with them. You can do tummy time and they can do visual tracking. And there's a whole host of, different things that you can do. A lot of the toddlers, even like some of the kiddos that are like kindergarten, I'd say first, second grade, a lot of those kiddos that I work with are autistic. So a
Mhm.
lot of what I focus on is like socializing, play, attention,
Okay.
just getting them, those foundational skills so that when they're in school, they can sit and attend and learn in a group setting, because that's usually very difficult for them. Um,
Right.
so I incorporate tons of movement into my sessions. I mean, I'm never sitting down. A lot of the kids, especially, after a school day, the last thing they want to do is sit down and,
Sure.
do
Right.
a board game or read a book, which those are all great things. But a lot of the kids that I work with crave a lot of that vestibular input, which is like movement and their balance and that different, that sense. So they crave a lot of movement. So we'll do things like obstacle courses. There's like
Wow.
swings that I have a swing that I'll bring with me, to certain visits and hang it up on the swing set outside, and the kids will go on the swings for core strengthening, visual tracking, bilateral coordination. So it's very much tailored to what is meaningful to the child, like what they enjoy doing, and then we can
Mhm.
kind of go from there and try to work on some of their goals. But it definitely varies. I think from person to person. Like, OT is very individualized, so
Mhm.
it really just depends.
And what is, we hear this phrase tummy time a lot. You
Mhm.
know, and I first to admit, as a mom, I don't know that I did it right. I knew we had to do tummy time. Not sure I did it right, but I tried. what what are some basics, as parents we could be doing as tummy time that actually helps strengthen our little ones, their cores, their skills? What are some things we could do?
Yeah, so floor play is really good when infants are, when they're within the first like few months of life, they can
Hmm.
see black, white, and red the best. So like you see a lot of these
Okay.
have like contrast to them. There's a ton,
Right.
very colorful toys for us. We're like, oh my gosh, that's beautiful and colorful. Well, for infants, that black, white, and red. So now there's more and more like books and I think, like cards, like different tummy time mats that incorporate those colors that can
Hmm.
help an infant be engaged. And I always say, if you as the parent can get on the floor with them, just you're probably the most engaging toy, for
Right. Right.
that really that they have. So tummy time is definitely important. Some of the little ones that I work with will even do like some side lying, so just helps to like shape the rib cage, especially my little ones that have reflux. I work with a lot of preemies that have just kind of
Okay.
out of the NICU. So, they might be experiencing, maybe they've had like, a G tube or there's something that sort of inhibits them from really being on their tummy. So we'll try to do, some side lying, even just having the infant like up on your chest. We'll use sometimes like a therapy ball and just kind of rock them slowly back and forth,
Oh,
side to side. And some infants are okay with it and they love tummy time, and then others, depending on if they have reflux or torticollis, like they might not take to it so easily. So those are all kind of
mhm.
factors we have to bring in and sort of work on. But I would say, it does sort of, again, like depend on the infant, but usually if we make tummy time a little bit more fun and engaging for them, like we can't really like put them on the floor and walk away. Won't work. I mean,
Right.
maybe for a couple minutes, but getting down on the floor with them and really helping them engage is a great way to kind of extend out how long they'll engage in tummy time.
And should we be working with them on things like, pushing up on their arms or rolling or?
Absolutely. Yeah. So, just things like reaching out in front of them or pushing up. You can have them like setting up like toys kind of like in a circle around them, have them like pivot. That's a good, kind of like those
Oh,
milestones that we don't, we hear about the sitting up and the rolling over and the crawling, but like in
right.
between those, there's some pretty awesome like mini milestones. So like pivoting is a really great one, or even like just rocking on their hands and knees, learning to reach just to develop that eye-hand coordination. I use bubbles with, oh my gosh, everyone. I mean, everyone loves bubbles, but that's a really great activity, as they get a little bit older, to start to really visually track and work on eye-hand coordination, reaching, all of those things, all those skills too.
Okay. I like that. Who doesn't love bubbles though,
Right?
right?
I know.
Bubbles are great. I love
They
bubbles.
are.
So in a previous podcast, which I'll include a link for those that didn't hear it with Brittany Murphy,
Yes.
she talked a little bit, pardon my voice, about primitive reflex integration.
Mhm.
And I've heard you also talk about that as well as sensory processing.
Yeah.
So if you would just take a minute to kind of explain what both of those are and how they relate to the work that you're doing with children and their development.
Right. Yeah. So, primitive reflexes, they develop in utero and they're really present for survival. They facilitate development and they also help with the birthing process. So, for instance, we all have, there's tons of these reflexes, but we have one that comes to mind is like the palmar reflex. So when there's an infant and they're small and you put your finger in their palm, they automatically close their hand around your
Mhm.
finger.
Right.
So that reflex is supposed to go away between, 6 to 12 months. When it doesn't go away and it lingers, and say like a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old, 7-year-old that's trying to write or use a spoon or a fork to feed themselves, they really don't have good control over their motor movements, because each time a stimuli touches
They
the palm
still try to.
of your hand, yes, they're going to grasp it. And
Okay.
so, you look, you want to see like that, this tripod grasp with an 8-year-old that's writing and printing and
Mhm.
or even, I'll hear some older kids that I work with say like, my hands like I just get so tired so quickly. Like they can't do the monkey bars, or they can't hold on to like one of those, like a trapeze, and, swing and pick up their back. They just can't really do a lot of those things. So with the retained reflexes, they can impact, reading and writing. They can impact toilet training, a lot
Really?
of emotional. Yeah. So the one, and this one is, the spinal gland, and that helps with the birthing process. So like when the infant is coming down the birthing canal and a stimuli touches one side of their back, they flex towards that feeling, towards the stimuli.
Okay.
Helps them kind of make their way down. A lot of infants are born via C-section. It's like
so they don't get that.
They don't have the ability for that reflex to emerge, and then the reflex is then retained. So that has a lot to do with bowel and bladder control. It's closely linked to auditory, our auditory sense, our sense of hearing. So, and, kind of going on, off of that, with retained reflexes, when those are present, you always have like some kind of confusion within the sensory system. So with sensory processing, I have a lot of kids that I work with maybe will, they might not want to touch, the sand that the kids are playing with in the sandbox outside at school, or they might, be kind of engaging in some unsafe behavior, like jumping off something that's too high or climbing up the furniture in the house, because they're seeking a lot of input and trying to regulate themselves, but they don't really know, the right way to do that. Obviously, a lot of them are young, but with retained reflexes, when you start to see the confusion in the sensory systems, because reflexes help the sensory systems to mature. So if like our foundation is kind of off a little bit and those reflexes aren't integrated, it affects their sensory processing as well.
Okay. Wow, that's fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would never have put those together. That's wild.
Yeah. And I think like, we don't talk about like, so the vestibular sense that, I just mentioned, that has a lot to do with movement and balance. That's located in the inner ear. And then proprioception, which is, it basically is, so, if you see kids that, someone comes home with the groceries and they run over and they want to like lift up something really heavy and like put it in the fridge, or, pushing a heavy box across a floor, that has a lot to do with signaling to their joints and muscles. It signals to their brain where their body is. So heavy work is something that is usually very regulating to these kids, and sometimes they don't get it as often as they need it. So that proprioceptive sense, something like, we'll do like animal walks, like, okay, walk like a bear or walk like a crab. So you're getting more input to your muscles and joints that signals to your brain, okay, this is where my body is. I'm doing, and I feel a little bit more regulated. Sometimes like weighted equipment will come in, or like even when we chew, like, crunchy snacks or things that are more difficult, that take a little bit more effort to manage. There's a whole host of ways that you can provide like that proprioceptive input. And even the vestibular input, like, swings or balancing on along a curb on a walk outside, a lot of kids gravitate towards these things, and we're like, oh, okay, that's too high for you, or, it's not right. We have to kind of, calculate that risk, but sometimes we want to encourage some of that, because it really does help the sensory systems, and usually will help to regulate the child if we can sort of, again, like help to make some of these activities a little bit more therapeutic for them, that they're already engaging in.
Right. So just support it in a safer way, maybe.
Right. Yeah. Yeah.
I like that. And you kind of touched on this, but as far as things like tongue tie releases and chronic sleep, how can occupational therapy assist these children?
Yeah. So I don't specialize in, like, I would say, like, there are some amazing OTs that specialize in like the pre-op and the post-op for the tongue tie, like the release and everything. I'm kind of in the realm right now where I scream. Thankfully, I met Brittany and I'm able to refer to her for the time being. I hope to learn a little bit more about that. But I'm able to sort of screen for it and see, okay, there is a restriction, let me refer out. But there are plenty of OTs that have amazing experience, with that. But as far as sleep, I mean, going back to occupation, sleep is a main occupation. So if we are not sleeping well and we are not breathing well, which I just recently looked at my caseload again, 85% of my caseload has some type of airway disorder.
Wow.
Whether or not it is, it is being treated or it's formally diagnosed, there is something there. I'll refer to Brittany. There's an ENT that's in town that I refer to as well. But sleep issues, it's, again, like every other occupation is impacted when we're not sleeping and when we're not breathing well. So, and sleep issues can arise from retained reflexes. So the spinal gland, as I mentioned before, that can impact bedwetting. So if a child has a retained reflex, so they're already not sleeping well and breathing well, which we know also breathing can be affected, or bedwetting can be affected by not breathing well too. But the spinal gland. So if they're waking frequently during the night anyway, and then on top of that, they're wetting the bed, 4 or 5 times a night, which also can disrupt their sleep.
Sure.
Children that are in a fight or flight. So our Moro reflex, there's another one called fear paralysis, has a lot to do with our fight, flight, freeze cycle. So when they're not breathing and they're startling and they're waking up, it's like, those hormones, the adrenaline and the cortisol are pumping through them because they're not breathing. It's survival for them at that point. So
Right.
a lot of different issues are arising because of the reflexes, but also because these kids aren't breathing well at night. I mean, the number of children on my intake form, I have a little portion about just asking about snoring and the restrictions, oral restrictions, and that they have reflux. Majority, like I was saying, of these children have, do have some type of issue with their airway. Even, their adenoids are enlarged or their tonsils, and it's visible to me, their palate is narrow.
Right.
I know I always forget the name of the scale, but it's, like when they open their mouth and you can't even see the uvula in the back. I always forget the name of that scale. But anyway, I mean, it's clear to me almost immediately when I do an evaluation that there's some type of breathing issue going on that's definitely impacting their sleep. So, as an OT, there's so much that we can do to help with sleep. And again, like a lot of it has to do with the sensory processing piece. So maybe, for instance, bath time. So maybe bath time is more alerting for some of our kids. As opposed to calming. So like instead of doing a bath, like right before bedtime, we can move it to the afternoon, and maybe, that linear swinging is more calming for them. So we can do that before bedtime. So there's certain ways, even like weighted equipment, that we can use. So there's like weighted lap pads, vibration. I have like a pillow that like vibrates. A lot of the kids really like that. So there's certain ways to get a child to sort of like regulate before bedtime. Even, I talk about sleep hygiene too. So a dark room, maybe, environmental sounds if they like the rain or, whatever the case may be. We talk about no screens before bedtime, not using the iPad or the TV. So there's a lot to do with the sleep hygiene, but I think as I'm entering a little more into your world, I'm standing and I'm very, straightforward now with families. And I'm telling them, like, if your child isn't breathing well, there's not much that I can really do. I mean, we can try and we can see, how it goes, but, so many of these kids, as soon as I see them, they have an open mouth posture and they're not breathing through their nose, and they can't breathe through their nose. Whether their adenoids are enlarged or it's a motor planning issue where they just have not been breathing through their nose for however many years. They're congested, enlarged adenoids, whatever the case may be. And again, like I will work on those things, but if they can't breathe through their nose because there's
only so much. Yeah.
Right. So I'm definitely still learning, but I feel as though, like I was saying before with sleep, if we're not breathing, we're just not getting adequate sleep. So
Right.
Yeah.
And I think the Mallampati scale, is that what you're thinking?
Yes, that's it. It never ever sticks in my brain. I'm going to write it down right now. Yes, that's it. Yeah.
It's a crazy word.
Mallampati. Patty. Yes.
Alan Patty. And I'll put a, for parents that haven't seen that, I'll put a link to that as well in the show notes so they can see it. Cause it's, once you see it and then you look at your child, it's very eye-opening.
Yes, it's just, yeah. And that's the thing, when parents have this knowledge, they can then advocate. I feel like, if you don't know what to look for initially, it's like, you don't know what you don't know. I'm still, I'm still learning about certain, areas too, but right. Like if they can see, okay, this is typical and this is maybe atypical and needs some intervention. Definitely.
Yep. And I really think we should rename this podcast, You Don't Know What You Don't Know, because I swear we say it at least once an episode.
Yeah. Well, and
because it just is.
Yeah. And I feel, even, I was talking to Brittany recently. When I did her podcast a few months ago, and, we were talking about that. And I feel like too, we were talking about torticollis and its relationship with oral restrictions. I didn't know about that 3 years ago. I didn't know to look in a child's mouth if there was something muscular happening, I could obviously, of course, like I do feel terrible about it, but I also feel for these parents that are like, oh man, like if I knew this sooner. So I think this podcast is wonderful because you do help to bring, some of this information into families' homes, because it's not something that is really talked about that often.
It's not. And another important thing is it's not just with parents. I mean, we don't know, but there's so many providers that, at least I'll say it or they'll say it every episode. You don't know what you don't know. Or we didn't learn this in med school. I didn't know it.
Right.
Yeah. We're all just kind of figuring this out together, which is really, and I know we touched on this a little bit, but, more specifically, how does occupational therapy help to rebuild a child's synaptic connections?
Yeah. So when you look at that concept of neuroplasticity, especially with reflexes, like retained reflexes, you basically can rewire the brain and you can, it's kind of that, use it or lose it concept. But a lot of kids that have these retained reflexes, like you'll see them compensating. So by that, I mean, they sort of they know, like, and some of the, I should also say too, some of the children that I work with just have retained reflexes and sensory processing. They don't have like a formal diagnosis. So they might not get it in school. So cognitively, they really understand like, I'm not doing that the same way as my friend is doing that, but I'm able to get it done. So for instance, a child that has an STNR reflex, which has to do with the upper and the lower body, you'll see them a lot of times, they kind of like anchor their feet around the chair. So like they kind of put their feet behind.
I know exactly what you're talking about.
Yes, because when their lower body is like flexing, it affects the upper body. So for them to sit in a chair and write something, it's like their upper body wants to do the opposite of what the lower body is doing. So for them to kind of flex their body, it's not like a normal movement for them. Like I could sit here and I could write and it's perfectly fine, but I have all of that going through my head if I have this retained reflex, and it's very difficult, but they're getting it done. Their handwriting might be a little bit sloppy, or they might rush through it, or, but they're getting it done. So with that concept of, neuroplasticity, as we kind of work on the exercises and activities to help integrate these reflexes, you're sort of creating new connections in the brain so that they don't have to compensate quite as much. They can kind of sit with their feet flat on the floor, and they're able to kind of maintain that postural control and engage like in a handwriting activity or a worksheet or something in school. So that's why a lot of, I can come in and, when I come into the home, I'll do a lot of these exercises and the activities, but the parent really has to make sure they're carrying over. Otherwise it won't have the same effect.
Right. Which makes sense.
Yeah.
Totally makes sense. So one of the things as parents, that if you have a child that's socially behind or underdeveloped, we hear a lot of is playgroups. Playgroups are the answer. So is that, I don't want to say always, because you're not supposed to say always and never, but more often, is that the right approach, or is there another avenue that we should be looking at as parents?
Yeah, I mean, I think that so Birth to Three is a wonderful resource. I still work in like early intervention a couple hours a month. So it's ages 0 through 3. And every state has a variation of it. They're called, different titles in different
Okay.
states. But that would always be like the very first thing I recommend is calling Birth to
Okay.
Three.
Okay.
I'll have some families that will even call me and they'll have like a 2-year-old or, 1.5-year-old. And I always ask them, did you contact Birth to Three first? Because you can get like a team of people. So it could look like a social worker, behavior therapist, an OT, a speech therapist, physical therapy. It's a team of people that are kind of with you, and they're able to sort of, your child has to be eligible for the service, which they come out evaluation. But even if they're not eligible, they'll still provide you with resources like play groups or there's a lot out there that they can provide to you, even if your child isn't eligible. I mean, as far as play groups, a lot of children that I work with do attend them, but sometimes it takes a little while, just because, and I think especially during COVID too, that social piece was sort of taken away from us.
Yeah,
So
all of us. Yeah.
very, very difficult for a lot of these infants that were born during COVID to then attend a play group with so much, they were overstimulated pretty much immediately.
Sure. Yeah.
So, I think again, like sensory wise, it really depends on the child, but playgroups can be a wonderful thing. I feel as though if your child is kind of overstimulated easily or quickly, it's always okay to just even talk to whoever's running the playgroup beforehand and just say, listen, we're going to come and maybe only for 3 minutes and then we're going to leave, so they don't have to be there. I always like to find, play groups or music groups where they can move, where they don't have to just sit down, because they need to move. They're probably not going to. So, I mean, parents can always reach out to them beforehand and ask these questions. Are they able to move? Can we come for 5 minutes and can we leave? Asking these questions before, and even bringing some of those maybe regulating toys for them. So, something like a little like fidget popper, or if they can eat a snack during, while they're kind of just watching. I'll have some kids that, even my little toddlers that I work with, that I'll sit with like on the outside, the outskirts sort of the, the play group, while everyone's in the middle there. And they just need to watch, like they just need to sort of observe for 1, 2, maybe 3, 3 sessions, and they feel a little bit more confident. And I think, but the beauty of Birth to Three too is, if the child is eligible, we go out into the community also. So having an extra support, and someone that's sort of, used to it, and is, it's okay if your child is crying, like that's what kids do, if they're apprehensive or scared. And I always recommend too, like a lot of the play groups that are local to my area are at libraries. So I always just say, bring them, bring them to the library before. You can even talk to them. This is where the play group will be, or this is where the music class will be next week when we come back. So you can do a lot of that like prep work sort of to sort of prepare them. But playgroups are, it's a wonderful way to get some of that socialization in, especially if they're not in like daycare, or if they're, maybe being, watched at home by a family member and they don't have the opportunity to really socialize. Playgroups are definitely great. It's just about finding the right fit.
Sure. And one of the things we see a lot with children with airway dysfunction, anxiety and depression, just they travel together with it. So, how can occupational therapy help these kind of kids?
Yeah. So, I think too, so usually what happens is with the retained reflexes, and it's so hard to know, like what came first in a way, but with these reflexes, I do see a lot of kids, especially like I'd say 8, 9, 10, that do have anxiety and depression. They do have this airway disorder, but maybe it hasn't been diagnosed yet. So while I refer out, in the meantime, we will work on that fight, flight, freeze cycle, because a lot of the kids that have anxiety and depression that I'm seeing do have those retained reflexes. So the Moro and the fear paralysis. So we'll slowly kind of start to integrate those. And then in addition to that, we kind of will find some of those sensory, strategies that really help the child. So I always start, like, it really, again, I always say, it depends, but I really
of course,
kind of
sure.
like to see if I feel as though a child is very, very anxious, I'm not going to jump right into reflex integration with them, because it can bring up some sensations in the body. You could make maybe tightness in their chest, or, they might not be ready to kind of sit with that and sort of like deal with it. So we'll look at, I do a sensory profile, which looks at different sensory systems and how that then can affect like their behavior or their environment, their, how they socialize. So I'll pull from that, and then I can kind of then make kind of like a list of strategies that I can give to the parent or to the child. So for instance, I talk about the swing a lot, but the swings, I'll usually, like, it's kind of like a lycra material. So it kind of like squeezes them when they sit in it. So they go in the swing, like fabric, and it gives them that sense of proprioception, because to the joint muscles, it's squeezing. And then the vestibular, that linear movement, which is calming. So we'll do some of that, like weighted equipment, potentially, anything to kind of like, I think, regulate them and understand, okay, like I might not feel so great after, because a lot of the kids too will tell me in so many different ways with reflex integration, oh, like this hurts, or like, I don't like that, or this makes me feel, could be, and I think, well, I know it's just an uncomfortable feeling when, I'll again, like when I'm testing the spinal galant reflex, you touch a child's back and you go down their back, and they don't have control over how they're moving. It's reflexive. It just happens. So,
instead of, you can do that and they don't move.
Yeah. So, right.
Okay.
They shouldn't move towards the stimulus right after that 12-month mark. So, I just evaluated a 12-year-old, and she said to me, like, oh my gosh, like that, I couldn't even control how my body moved when you did that. And I was like, I know,
wow.
Even a 5-year-old that I had yesterday, I was working on her palmar reflex. And she said to me, when you touch my hand here, my fingers move and it hurts and I don't like it. So that's not right. Like that palmar, it's not supposed to happen, but they just like, it's such an out of control feeling for them. So I have to kind of be able to say and explain it as best I can to them. This is, you're right. Like, this is how it feels. And it might feel a little uncomfortable, but it will feel better. This is why I'm here. And we're working on, how, so, I feel as though with the anxiety and the depression, I would say 95% of the time, those children, in addition to the airway disorder, have retained Moro or fear paralysis reflexes too.
Wow.
Yeah.
So what about weighted blankets for these kids to sleep with? Is that good, or is that, I don't know, does that help, or is that something that's going to freak them out?
Right. So listen, again, like some kids like them a lot. Other kids are like, get this thing off of me. I can't tolerate it. So, I mean, listen, I sleep with a weighted blanket every single night. So does my husband. We have like 2 of them on the bed, so you're not supposed to technically sleep with them on you, but with children, because what can happen is their body can get like immune to it and it won't have the same effect.
Gotcha.
Okay. And it should be supervised as well. But
so it's more like, hey, take a nap, or hey, watch a little TV with it, or read a book, and then take it away.
Yes.
Okay.
So, and they can kind of, sometimes the weighted blankets too, I feel like, well, sometimes these kids like to have like a weighted stuffed animal or like a lap pad a little bit more. I think it's a little more preferred sometimes, but the weighted blanket, even like a heavier blanket that you have in your house, like a throw blanket, sometimes that will like do the trick as well. But yeah, I mean, the weighted equipment, when And again, so with weighted equipment too, there's like that tactile system, so our sense of touch. So some kids, I know, like if they can't tolerate wearing a backpack, which this time is coming up very, very quickly with the fall, I'm going to have to start working on practicing wearing backpacks with my little ones. If they don't like how that feels on their body, usually they won't tolerate any type of weight on them. So we'll just have to find other ways. So different, heavy work activities for them to do. Some of the older kids, like I work with a 12-year-old and he'll take a TheraBand and he'll like pull on the TheraBand now, or like lift 3-pound weights or something with his dad downstairs, so there's other ways to give them that input if they just can't tolerate the weighted blanket, but usually that is a more calming strategy.
And you mentioned kids that can't handle, the feeling of a backpack, and, we are coming into that time of year. Yeah. What about, if you're a parent of that kind of child, what do? Can you do are the rollies the way to go until they're used to it, or can you ease them into it? What's the right option?
Yeah. So I think with OT too, one of my favorite, I guess, attributes is that we can, we adapt kind of the environment, or you can use some type of, adaptive equipment. So something that does roll, it might look a little bit different. Something they can just sort of like carry in their hand. If we can come up with something like that. Usually that hypersensitive tactile system, in addition to not wanting something on their back, has a lot to do with those spinal reflexes. So look at those. Okay. But yeah, so we can I like to say, usually we do get there. We'll start practicing, next month. I'll just have the parent bring the backpack, and sometimes if it is weighted, which it shouldn't be that heavy, but if there is a little bit more, maybe a couple of books in there or something, not too heavy, but sometimes kids are more willing to try it if it's a little bit heavier, because it gives them that regulating feeling.
Okay. Oh, that's interesting. So how do I, as a parent, how do I know that maybe my child needs occupational therapy?
Yeah. So, really it's if they're, if the child's daily life is impacted, and if your life is impacted too. So, if they're picky eaters, you can't sit down and have a meal, and I mean, not half an hour, if they are looking at food and it makes them want to gag, and they can't stand the smell of the food when you're cooking on the stove. If they're not meeting those developmental, I don't love the word milestones, but those developmental ranges, if they are going from, they're sitting on the floor and then they're 8 months old and they're standing, it's we want them to be able to roll and reach and crawl, it's so important, because when we just go to, maybe just sitting on the floor to then standing, they're locking their joints out, and they don't have to use that fluid movement or the muscle to stand. It's I'm compensating. I've learned how to do this, and now I'm just going to start walking. We want kids to crawl. So if they're sort of, I always say anything with sleep, if they're struggling with potty training, difficulty tolerating sensory input. So again, some kids, they just don't love having their hair washed, or, it's bath time is supposed to take, 25 minutes and it's taking you 2 hours, start to finish. So any of those occupations that are really, really impacted, I would also just say if they're toe walking or the open mouth posture or sitting in that W, they have some of that low tone, emotional dysregulation. So a lot of the kids with their retained reflexes too, you'll see, I feel the majority of the referrals that I get are for the social emotional piece. So kids that just, have a lot of trouble interacting with their friends, or, they lose a game and it's they just throw the game across the room and they run out, and they're upset lingers for, an hour or two, so anything like that. But I always say if their daily lives are impacted and yours are too, it's definitely time to reach out to an OT.
And I mean, I know obviously one of the things we advocate for is this, holistic ecosystem of providers. And let's look at the child as a whole and let's all work together. Dentists talk to pediatricians, talk to occupational therapists, lactation, let's all work together. So if your provider doesn't have somebody they can recommend for you and, you have to go off and Google or however, when you start the process of looking for an occupational therapist, what are some things that parents can ask so we can make sure, this is the right fit for our child?
Yeah. So I think honestly, like even if you are doing your own research and you are kind of like Googling and you find a couple, maybe 2 or 3 occupational therapists that you're interested in, I think, whatever your concerns are, there's nothing wrong with kind of calling and asking for a consult and, a phone consult and just saying like, these are my concerns. What can you do to help with this? I hate to, I hate to go back to this. I feel like social media can be a wonderful, wonderful thing. And at times it's not so great, but I feel as though through my social media too, like I'm getting more referrals that way because people are finding me and reaching out, and I always will do a phone consult, but I feel as though, even reaching out to, people have messaged me from all across the country. I mean, even outside of the country, asking this question, especially when it comes to retained reflexes and the sensory piece. And I will try to find them somebody. If they're in Texas or California or wherever they are, I'll send them to, certain directories to look for OTs that can help them with what they want. I post a lot about retained reflexes and sensory on my Instagram, and that's really, I'm able to do that. And that's partially why I started my own business, because I felt like I was very restricted prior to. So, you can always reach us. I mean, I always get back to people. I don't know, however anyone else is, I get it. Like it could be overwhelming at times, but sure. I always think too, like it doesn't hurt just to reach out to people, other professionals on social media, and even, asking, sometimes if, again, like if someone's open to talking about it, asking around, I feel like by word of mouth, you really get better, a true recommendation, and someone that had a good experience, maybe. So maybe a friend of a friend had, their daughter needed OT and it was the best experience and she was a great OT. And, so I think just kind of asking, unfortunately too, with, a lot of pediatricians, and not all, but some, it's kind of like this wait and see approach where like, if it were me, we would intervene right away. Whereas, so parents also have to advocate for that sometimes. Like it sometimes
absolutely,
I think, I'm hoping that this can change, but as far as development, unless you're seeing a developmental pediatrician, they don't really know a whole bunch about development or, airway or, anything like that. So yeah, I think it's very important to follow, your intuition. If you feel like something is wrong, don't let it go. There's always outpatient services too. And I always say, like, even if you get into an outpatient or you start with birth to 3 or you start with an OT, and it's not going well, you can always, ask to change providers. Usually with birth to 3 or outpatient, there's other therapists. And if it's not a good connection, don't be afraid to ask to change providers either.
That makes sense. So at the end of every episode, I always like to hand the floor back to our guests because, y'all are the experts, best. So is there anything else you'd like to add, or a last thought to leave with parents, or maybe something we didn't cover that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I think, especially with, I think kind of going off of what I was just saying about following your intuition, a lot of families that call me, I'm kind of like their last phone call. Like a lot of them feel, I think, a little bit defeated because they've known for a long time, like something is going on and we can't quite put our finger on it. So I feel as though something that's very important is to definitely follow your intuition, but then you have to start really advocating for what you think is right for your child. Because I have sent so many kids to an ENT that doesn't have experience with Airway, unbeknownst to me, and they've come back and said, nope, they're fine. And it's like, well, they have circles under their eyes and they have an open mouth posture and they're snoring and they're grinding their teeth at night and they're waking up. And so I think just, unfortunately, the world that we live in, just doing your own research and really trying to figure it out on your own, and then taking that with you to a medical professional or healthcare professional. I think that when something seems like it's a little bit off, even if it is just a little bit off, early intervention it's priceless. You can never go back, so that's why, especially with birth to 3, getting families started, even if they're just on the cusp of qualifying, I always say, just take it and run. The same thing with outpatient OT. I think that like the earlier that we can get in there and kind of start helping, even with Airway, the better the outcome will be. So I always just feel as though if a parent or a caregiver thinks that maybe something might be off, usually they're right. And to kind of, and sometimes also just getting a second opinion, if you still feel like, oh, I don't know this, I went to this specialist and I'm not really sure, definitely getting a second opinion can, maybe confirm what you were thinking might be going on.
Right. Because your child best.
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, thank you so much for being on today and for, sharing your information with us. Really, really appreciate it.
Of course, Rebecca. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely.